Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 62. Mrs. Ned Kelly? Was Bridget O'Brien Ned Kelly's wife? There was an interesting book that was written looking at the background of Ned Kelly and connections that he may have had, and there were several theories behind whether Ned Kelly had married somebody, and there were a number of women that were possibilities, and Bridget O'Brien was one of them. Bridget O'Brien was the proprietor of the Greta Hotel, and it's been discounted by many, due to her being 14 years older than Ned, that she may have been his wife. However, there are links that may prove otherwise. Bridget O'Brien was born Bridget Conway in 1838 in Limerick, Ireland. She was the daughter of Thomas Conway and Bridget Cahill. Bridget departed Liverpool, England in 1864, and the shipping record stated she was a servant, aged 27. She sailed on the Golden Empire, which had to be quarantined because of fever on board, and it landed in Melbourne on the 16th of January 1865. She married Lawrence O'Brien on the 14th of August 1870 in Wangaratta, Victoria. Lawrence O'Brien was born in Tipperary, Ireland in 1838. He emigrated with his family when he was 14 and left Plymouth on the 22nd of February 1851 on the Emperor and arrived in Sydney on the 6th of June 1851. His father owned lands at Bylands near Kilmore. On the 8th of November 1867 in Greta, Victoria, Lawrence was issued with a publican's licence for the Newmarket Hotel at Greta. He later built the Victoria Hotel at Greta. A horse was killed in the stable of the Lawrence family pub, and there was an article that outlined this case. It was in the North Eastern Ensign on the 17th of January 1873, and it outlined the court proceedings in the Wangaratta Police Court. John Lloyd was charged with killing a horse. William Barnett deposed, "I'm a farmer residing at Greta. I remember on the 21st of December I had a grey horse in Mr. O'Brien's paddock adjoining mine. I saw my horse at O'Brien's stable door and he was dead. He was covered with blood, apparently cut with a tomahawk in 8 or 9 places on the legs, on the forehead, on the rump and on the ribs. A piece of green hide was on the horse's head. The grey horse was the only horse I had. When I found the horse dead, I traced the tracks of blood from O'Brien's stable back to Lloyd's house by the marks of the horse's shoes, and I knew they were the tracks of my horse." Constable Flood on oath stated, "I remember on Sunday the 23rd of December, I saw O'Brien, who spoke to me about a grey horse which was lying in his yard. The horse was chopped about the head and the neck, apparently with a heavy sharp instrument. I searched and found tracks and blood marks from where the horse lay to before the door of the defendant's house. I found at Lloyd's house 2 pools of blood outside the door. I asked what were the blood marks and was told by the defendant it was Brian's marks. Afterwards, asked to see the Brian cask. He refused and said he would not unless I had a warrant. I took the defendant to see the tracks and he said they were blood marks. The defendant, when I saw him, had blood marks on his trousers and shirt. He said that he cut his finger the day before with a reaping hook, and that accounted for the blood marks on his shin and trousers. I took the reaping hook, the trouser and the shirt from him. I showed him the green hide rope and asked him if it was his. He said no, it was not his. I asked him if he ever owned one similar to it, and he said he never did. The rope had the appearance of being freshly cut." And Lawrence O'Brien deposed, "I'm a hotel keeper residing at Greta. I remember the 22nd of December last and found a grey horse dead near my stable." So John Lloyd got 4 years imprisonment for that offence. On the 9th of December 1873, Lawrence O'Brien was listed as owning the Market Hotel at Greta. However, Lawrence died on the 5th of October 1874 when he was only 36. In the Ovens and Murray Advertiser, it was outlined, "Fatal accident. A serious accident occurred at Oxley on Saturday, which unfortunately had terminated fatality. Mr. Lawrence O'Brien of Greta had been attending a monthly meeting at the Oxley Shire Council, of which he was a member, and towards evening started homewards on horseback, accompanied by 3 or 4 others who were travelling in the same direction. He had not got more than a quarter of a mile from the township when his horse shied at something on the road, and the unfortunate rider was thrown heavily, striking his head violently on the hard metal. Upon his comrades rushing to his assistance, they found him bleeding from a large wound at the back of the head. He was promptly conveyed to Mr. Dunlop's hotel, and Mr. Hutchinson was at once sent from Wangaratta. On his arrival, the doctor found his patient suffering from concussion of the brain. The poor man lingered until yesterday morning when he died. Most people in the district know Mr. O'Brien, and as he was more often called Larry O'Brien, than whom a steadier or more industrious man could hardly be found. For many years he's resided at Greta, being the host of the Victoria Hotel, one of the best bush inns we know of, and his death will be a great loss to the district in which he lived and which he was universally respected. He died without a will, which required all of his assets and debts to be investigated. The probate stated that he was a storekeeper at Greta. His assets were 34 acres of land purchased in May 1874, 6 acres of land that held a 9-room brick hotel, 10 acres of land with a weatherboard store, which was used as a police station, 2 acres with a slaughterhouse, a 6-acre block and a 2-acre block, all at Greta. Bridget was the sole beneficiary of the will. Bridget continued to run the pub with the help of her brother-in-law Daniel Kennedy. Daniel helped her from 1874 to 1882, and she got a number of government contracts to provide food to officials. Daniel Kennedy had married Bridget's sister Julia in 1869. On the 20th of May 1880, Daniel Kennedy was named as a police informant, and he had reported that the Kelly gang had successfully made bulletproof armour out of agricultural equipment and were planning another raid. On the 25th of June, Kennedy personally reported this information to Sergeant Hare, and Hare dismissed the intelligence as preposterous and sacked Kennedy as the informant. And a little bit about Daniel Kennedy. In 1882, July 1882, he was mentioned in an article. Mr. Daniel Kennedy, who had charge of the Glenwarren School since the removal of Mr. Curnow, is about to be transferred to Winchelsea. Mr. Kennedy was first employed as a teacher in 1867 and was located in Benalla for 3 years. He afterwards managed the business of Mrs. O'Brien at Greta, and when the vacancy occurred at Glenrowan School some 2 years ago, he made an application to the government and was appointed to the management of it. Mr. Kennedy had some valuable farm property 3 miles from Glenrowan, which he later sold. He is a very efficient teacher and a gentleman, and his departure from the district will be regretted by a large circle of friends. So it seems that around the time that Sergeant Hare dismissed his role as informant, he went back to teaching. So it seems that Daniel Kennedy was in a very good position to obtain some inner information on the Kelly gang, and that also raises questions as to how close Bridget O'Brien was to the Kelly gang, considering he was managing her pub. On the 24th of December 1874, the Oxley Licensing Court, it mentions that Bridget O'Brien held the Victoria Hotel in Greta. And it is in around January 1878 that Bridget was rumoured to have married, in inverted commas, Ned Kelly. Bridget was 40 in 1878, which would have made Ned only 24. Was Daniel Kennedy aware of it and not happy about it? And that was actually part of the reason why he became an informant. There was a possible link with Bridget and Sergeant Kennedy's watch that was missing from the Stringy Bark incident when the police were shot by the Kelly gang. And this incident occurred on the 25th of October 1878. So in the same year, the theory was that they were married. There's an interpretive signage at Barmer Punt. Barmer's on the Murray, on the New South Wales-Victorian border, and it says Mr. J. Maloney's ownership of the punt was not without some excitement. Local legend has it that in early February 1879, Ned Kelly and his gang crossed the Murray River into New South Wales at Barmer on the punt that was captained by Enoch Trickey. Trickey reported that the gang had a leisurely game of cards at the Barmer Hotel before Ned Kelly bought a horse for £50. So the Stringy Bark incident occurred, and then Ned and the gang moved over into New South Wales. And in March 1879, in the Riverine Herald, It says reliable intelligence has come to hand from which it is certain that the Kelly gang has not crossed into Victoria. For the last 3 weeks, the outlaweds have been proceeding to the Darling River and keeping with the Mallee Scrub along the Murray. It appears that this route is well known to Ned Kelly, who's been in the habit of annually visiting the Gannawarra station at shearing time. From this station, it's alleged they will make Moolameen and cross the Murrumbidgee River near Balranald. And in May 1879, members of the Lloyd family, who are related by marriage to the notorious Kellys, were assembled in Mrs. O'Brien's hotel at Greta, drinking and indulging in feats of strength, but no ill-feeling or anything tending to create a row was displayed, none of the men being, it appears, the worse for drink. So there's further evidence that there's a direct link between the Kelly gang, their relatives, and Bridget O'Brien being the publican of one of the hotels at Greta, where we know Ned Kelly's mother and siblings lived. On the 30th of June 1880, which was after the Glenrowan siege, there's a small section that says, "Leave their deaths unavenged. All day long, scenes like these continued. Drink was brought over from Mrs. O'Brien's hotel, and they were all the more or less in a state of intoxication and dangerously inclined." And on the 17th of August 1880, in one of Saturday's issues, we stated that the auction sale of the stock in trade in the assigned estate of Mrs. Bridget O'Brien, hotel and storekeeper at Greta, is to be conducted by Mr. William Weaver on Thursday the 12th. So it seems that in August 1880 that Bridget has sold up. And Eugenie Navarre's book, Ned, Night in Aussie Armour, it mentions that by September the 25th, 1880, so a month later, Bridget was featured in a report by W.D. Montford to Constable James Dwyer. And there's reference to this in an article in December 1905. Death of ex-Superintendent Montford. Mr. W.B. Montford, ex-Superintendent of Police, whose death is announced today, came into prominence in 1874 in connection with the capture of Power, a notorious bushranger. The good work done by Mr. Montford in this matter resulted in him being promoted sergeant to sub-inspector. He afterwards became a superintendent and had charge of the Burke district, his retirement from the police taking place in 1894. So this report written by W.D. Montford says, "A report from a lady living in Melbourne who did not wish to be identified stated that the wife of Ned Kelly is a domestic servant with Mr. J.H. Jested, proprietor of the Continental Hotel Deniliquin, and is called Medella. She is 25 to 35 years of age." Bridget would have been 42, 5 foot 6 or 7 inches high, long dark hair, dark complexion, hazel eyes, masculine features, and dresses very respectably. The informant said that Medella received a splendid watch from Ned Kelly kept in a jewellery box, and the theory is that it's likely to have been Sergeant Kennedy's watch, taken at Stringy Bar Creek on the 25th of October, 1878. She said she'd only been married to Ned for 3 months before he took to bushranging. In Dagmar Belcarek and Gary Dean's book, Ned and the Others, this information also came from Ned himself. When Ned was dishing out one of his speeches to the prisoners up in Jerilderie on the 10th of February 1879, he was reported to have told them, "When outlawed, I was only 3 weeks married." The informant also said that a lady saw a letter from Kitty Kelly to Medella that commenced with "My dear sister-in-law." So you might think it's a bit of a stretch looking at Bridget O'Brien's age. However, from the time that Bridget O'Brien had auctioned off her hotel in Greta, there was 2 years where she wasn't mentioned at all. There was nothing until 2 years later. And 2 years later, Ned Kelly and the gang had been arrested, jailed, and Ned hung. So is it possible that Bridget O'Brien was the Lady Medella? That she had married Ned Kelly 3 months prior to him being declared an outlaw around October, November 1878, when she was still in Greta running the hotel? Or was she simply planted at Deniliquin as a sympathiser for the Kellys, so they knew that they had somebody close by that could house them and keep them? And there were a few mentions linking Kennedy's watch. One of them says, "Ned Kelly was boasting to the men taken by the outlaws of his prowess. He took great credit to himself for bravery and proudly showed Kennedy's watch." So in December 1878, which was 2 months after the Stringy Bark Creek affair, there were reports that Ned Kelly was brandishing Kennedy's watch and showing it to others. There's also another article a couple of days later in 1878 saying Kelly also stated to one of his prisoners at Young Husband's Station that he had Sergeant Kennedy's watch, and Mr. Scott saw a gold watch in his possession that did correspond in the appearance to Sergeant Kennedy's one. 2 years later, in July 1880, it says the duty of searching the outlaw was entrusted to Senior Constable Kelly, who only found a threepenny piece, a silver watch and a few chains on him. On asking the outlaw what he did with Kennedy's watch, he said he wouldn't tell. So that was the time where he had been arrested and he was in jail in Melbourne. Another reference, with regard to Sergeant Kennedy's watch, it appears that Ned Kelly does not exactly know in whose possession it now is, but he has promised that if he can ascertain, he will take steps to have it restored to Mrs. Kennedy. It was known that the Kelly gang traded horses around Deniliquin. Deniliquin locals recalled Dan Kelly living at one of the hotels in Deniliquin, and there was also a recollection of a man digging on 2 properties on the river owned by the Landales, Chippenham Park and Darwilly, and the rumour was that he was looking for what Ned Kelly had buried there. Deniliquin locals also heard that after the hold-up at Jerilderie that Ned had spent a night at a Deniliquin hotel, and that would have been on the 10th of February 1879. And that correlates with the time that the lady that was known as Medela was in occupation at the hotel. So the Continental Hotel was built by Julius Sesdet in 1878, and the building traded as a hotel until 1887. It had 2 bars, 4 parlours, dining and billiard rooms, bedrooms, bathrooms and kitchens over 3 floors, including a cellar. So this could very well have been the hotel that Dan Kelly stayed at, and also quite easily Ned Kelly could have stayed at. They definitely knew Bridget O'Brien. The gang had drunk more than once at her pub in Greta. On the 14th of February 1879, in the Argus, the Kelly gang, by electric telegraph from our own correspondents at Jerilderie. It is believed that the Kellys are only a short distance from Jerilderie and waiting to ascertain the movements of the police. Residents are positive that they are still Confederates in town who are informing the Kellys of everything that is going on. 4 men were seen riding on bay horses 6 miles from Jerilderie, well armed and looked like police, asking for the road to Conago, which is a small township north of Deniliquin. It has since transpired that they're not police. In Echuca, it was reported considerable excitement was caused today by the report of the proximity to Echuca of the Kelly gang. At a late hour last night, the Deniliquin police communicated with the Echuca Police Department to the effect that the outlaws were in the vicinity of Deniliquin and had made inquiries as to the shortest route to Moama. Deniliquin also asked for reinforcements of police, and 2 Echuca troopers were sent. Sergeant Hayes of Echuca has since received instructions to be watchful, and 4 troopers have been sent to supplement the local force. The Moama police have gone towards Red Bank, which is now known as Mathara, in search of the Kellys. Mackay Times on the 20th of February 1879, interview with the Kelly gang. News of the Kelly gang of outlaws is always received with interest, but the news becomes more interesting still when mentioned in connection with townsmen. Mr. Thomas Merrifield, whose family reside at Heathcote, but who himself is at present engaged in carrying with his teams on the road between Hay and Deniliquin, had the honour, if honour it may be termed, of an encounter with the outlaws subsequent to their raid on Jerilderie. He fell in with them about 5 miles from that township, near a hotel, not far from a station on the road from Jerilderie to Deniliquin, and conversed with them, principally Ned Kelly, for some time. The bushranger recounted to Merrifield what had taken place at Jerilderie, the sticking up of the bank, and pointed to the money taken from the bank strapped to his saddle. Kelly said that he was fully determined to shoot Constable Devine and was only prevented from doing so by the constable's wife going down on her knees and pleading hard for his life. They were then anxious to find the bank manager, believing he was on his way to Deniliquin to give information, and questioned Merrifield as to whether he'd seen him, and afterwards searched the hotel for him, Ned Kelly stating that he would shoot him if they found him. Ned passed some remark about Merrifield's horses, to the effect that they would be a fine set to take to Cooper's Creek. Merrifield, however, told him that he thought that they would be too heavy for him and urged Kelly not to take them, pitching a yarn to him about him being a poor man. Kelly then said he never robbed a poor man and he never would do so and would not take the horses. Merrifield recognised the Kellys at once by portraits in the papers, and as they rode up, revolvers in hand and rifles slung around their necks, he describes Ned as a fine-made man. A person who's just returned from Jerilderie and that part informs us that there was every opportunity afforded of capturing or shooting the gang when at the station after leaving Jerilderie. The Kellys are stated to have gone about the station quite unprepared for a sudden attack, and Hart and Byrne, who'd kept about 200 yards off, were so drunk that they could hardly sit on their horses. There were several hands at the station sitting and standing about outside who took the affair very quietly. So based on those range of articles, we could easily pinpoint Ned Kelly at coming from Jerilderie to Deniliquin and down towards Moama directly after the Jerilderie robbery. And the old story in Deniliquin about Ned Kelly burying in two spots some of his loot is quite feasible, considering that Merrifield did observe that Ned Kelly did have quite a bit of money strapped to his saddle at the time. So did he bury it near Deniliquin on the river, knowing that he had Bridget O'Brien there, and knew that he was quite possibly returning to Deniliquin fairly often and could get it later? In June 1879, police searched Bridget O'Brien's bags for ammunition on the train's return journey from Melbourne to Glenrowan, and also on this train were Tom Lloyd and Maggie Skilling. And as mentioned before, the Lloyds were related to and very close to the Kellys. So the fact that she was on the same train and they searched her for ammunition, I feel that the police started to work out that Bridget O'Brien was more involved in the Kelly gang as an informant like the others, and quite possibly family. In Ian Jones's book, A Short Life, he mentions that Constable Robert Graham set up his station above Bridget O'Brien's hotel on the 29th of September 1880, assisted by 3 constables, Leigh, MacDonald and Wallace. This last fellow was the Wallace that eventually married Bridget O'Brien. What about the plain silver ring that we see Ned Kelly wearing in a photograph the day before he was hung? And he was still wearing this when he fell from the drop, as noted in the Bendigo Independent. Was it a wedding ring that was worn on the ring finger of his right hand to fool the police? Or was that ring proudly displayed in that photo for the benefit of someone apart from his known family? Is he saying a last goodbye to his wife? It was reported on the 16th of May 1881. Descending a very bad track to the first country, the board visited Mrs. O'Brien's hotel at Greta. The old hotel and store, which did such a famous trade in its former years, is still standing, and the new one, a spacious 2-storey brick mansion built out of the profits acquired in the former store, is in a semi-deserted state, the business having fallen off wonderfully. 4 policemen are stationed at this place and occupy the upper storey rooms as barracks. They have comfortable quarters and grub, as they term it, at the hotel. As we know, one of the hotels from when Lawrence O'Brien died, it's listed as a police station. And so there was obviously a deal done that the police constables that were stationed there had accommodation and board, food and so on at Bridget's hotel. So not only possibly did she have close connections with Ned and his gang, she was also able to get information through the police that were there as well. So Bridget O'Brien married William John Richard Wallace, a police constable in 1882 in Victoria. In 1884 and 1885 they ran the Tallangatta Inn, and from 1885 to 1889 they ran the Broken River Hotel in Benalla. In 1899 the hotel licence was transferred to Owen Mellon, husband of Catherine Conway, who was Bridget's niece. Wallace wrote letters to the Victorian Police, and one was written on the 19th of July 1892 from Benalla, and it states, "I have used every endeavour for a number of years to recover the watch taken from the late Sergeant Kennedy by the Kelly gang in October 1878. I have so far succeeded in getting a promise that the watch would be handed to me on payment of reward. Would you be good enough to inform me whether the Crown would refrain from prosecuting whoever has it?" And another letter, the 23rd of April 1893, the Chief Commissioner of Police received a telegram from Benalla, recovered the late Sergeant Kennedy's watch taken by the Kelly gang, and sending it to Mrs. Kennedy, W. Wallace, Broken River Hotel. And there are a couple of articles referring to this. A reminiscence of the Kelly gang, Sergeant Kennedy's watch recovered, restored to a comrade of the murdered man. Benalla on Monday, Mr. W.J.R. Wallace, landlord of the Broken River Hotel, on Saturday evening became possessed of the gold watch Sergeant Kennedy was wearing when he was murdered by the Kelly gang at the Wombat 15 years ago. The watch, which had been presented to the deceased by the Anti-Cattle Stealing Association for services rendered in suppressing cattle stealing, has not received much ill usage during its 15 years retention. The case is in good order, but the work shows sign of having been operated upon unskilled hands. It became known to Mr. Wallace some 12 months ago that the watch was in the possession of a certain person in the district, and he then used his influence to have it restored to Mrs. Kennedy, but his efforts failed. He was surprised, therefore, to find the watch in a parcel which had been left by a little girl at the hotel during his absence. Mr. Wallace, although he was engaged in the pursuit of the outlaws, being then a mounted constable, is much respected by the relatives of the Kellys, and hence it is that the watch has been sent to him. On Saturday night, he telegraphed to Mansfield, to the widow of the late sergeant, apprising her of the fact that the watch is in his possession, and he received a reply expressive of delight of the announcement. And another article referring to the watch, Mr. W.J.R. Wallace of the Broken River Hotel Benalla has been successful in obtaining possession of a watch that was taken from Sergeant Kennedy at Stringy Bark Creek, Wombat Ranges by the Kelly gang. Mr. Wallace, once a member of the police force, had a good idea where the watch was, for years has been trying to secure and restore it to Mrs. Kennedy. There was an erroneous impression about the reward of £50 that had been offered for its restoration, and an individual whose name Mr. Wallace declines to disclose offered to get the watch back if there was no fear of prosecution. Mr. Wallace wrote to the Chief Commissioner, who replied there was no reward, and as the persons who stole the watch were clearly dead, no prosecution would be initiated. Mr. Wallace also wrote to Mrs. Kennedy, who replied that she would give a reward of £5. This correspondence took place in July, and nothing more was heard until Thursday, when a little girl left in the bar of the hotel a brown paper parcel addressed to Mr. Wallace, who was not told of the matter until Saturday. He opened the parcel and found a gold watch with the initials MK on it, and on referring to a description published in an old police gazette, he saw that it was the watch presented to Sergeant Kennedy by the Anti-Cattle Stealing Association. And in May 1894, it mentions Mr. Wallace's reminiscences are very interesting. He knows a great deal more than he says. Daren't tell how I recovered Sergeant Kennedy's watch, and Mrs. Kennedy has it now, and it has been, as she writes me, a great happiness for her to have it. It doesn't matter how I got it, there's been no dirty work. So my theory is that Bridget O'Brien did let her husband know that she had the watch, or possibly Mr. Wallace found the watch in Bridget's possession, and it was decided so many years after Ned's death that she would return it to the wife. They felt that they couldn't divulge to the police that Bridget O'Brien had it, because then that may have really opened up the truth of possibly that Ned and Bridget had been married. William Wallace died in 1908 in East Brighton, Victoria, and there was an announcement of his death in the paper. Mr. W.J.R. Wallace, for a long time the lessee of the Broken River Hotel, but who settled in the storekeeping line 8 years ago at Cowra in Gippsland. His demise took place at Brighton, being 56. In the 80s, he married Mrs. O'Brien, who in those days ran the Greta Hotel, but in 1885 succeeded Mr. R. Louch as the publican in Benalla. For years he represented the central riding of the Shire and was always regarded as a large-hearted man, whilst as a councillor he was both zealous and energetic. The news of his death was received as a surprise in Benalla, and much sympathy is being expressed for Mrs. Wallace in her bereavement. And another article, the death is announced in the papers of Mr. W.J.R. Wallace at his residence, McKinnon Street, Brighton. The deceased was a prominent resident of Benalla during the 80s and 90s. He was originally a member of the police force and for some time stationed in the Greta district until he met with an accident which occasioned his retiring on a pension. In the early 80s, he married Mrs. O'Brien, who had the Greta Hotel, and shortly after went to reside for a time at Tallangatta. About 1885, they took over the Broken River Hotel at Benalla. In August 1887, Mr. Wallace was elected to represent Central Riding in the Shire Council, and 2 years afterwards he was elected Shire President. He also at different times filled offices of presidency of the Agricultural Society, Racing Club, Coursing Club and Captain of the Fire Brigade, in all of which institutions he took a very active interest. About 8 years ago, he sold out of the Broken River Hotel and went to reside in Gippsland, carrying on a storekeeping business from which he retired 2 years ago. So after her husband's death, Bridget was listed as living with her niece, Catherine Maylan, in South Elsternwick, Victoria in 1912, and Bridget died in Carlton, Victoria in June 1923, aged 85. Her estate of £87.13 was left equally between her niece, Toddy Kennedy, and her great-niece, Eileen Maylin. So, of Bridget's siblings who came to Australia, she had a brother, Owen, who was born in 1830 in Limerick. He came to Australia on the 19th of May 1852 and he married Ellen Delaney in Victoria in 1860. In 1876, Owen obtained land at Tarcombe near Kilmore, and it mentions the sale of his farm in 1881, well-fenced agricultural farm of 320 acres, 6 miles from Avenel. Mr. Owen Conway is to sell by auction at the Mutton's Harvest Home Hotel at Avenel. His farm of 320 acres consisting of rich alluvial flats with 1.25 miles frontage to Hughes Creek, the whole securely fenced, 6 miles of split 3-bar fencing upon it and rung throughout, a large portion having been cultivated. So once he sold this property, he purchased 62 acres of land at Kingupna in 1882, and Owen also ran a hotel there. And Owen died at Kingupna, Victoria, on the 2nd of October 1888, aged 58, of inflammation of the lungs. He had a daughter, Catherine Conway, in Victoria in 1860, and it was Catherine's husband, Owen Maylin, that Bridget and William Wallace sold the licence of the Broken River Hotel, Benalla, to in 1899. Catherine was executrix of her aunt Bridget Wallace's will. Her sister Julia was born in 1840 in Limerick Island. She immigrated on the Golden Empire and arrived on the 16th of January 1865 with her sister. She married Daniel Kennedy in 1869 in Victoria, and they had 9 children, with one only living into adulthood. Julia died in Warrigal, Victoria on the 16th of May 1888, aged only 48. And only 3 of her children at the time of her death had survived her: Bridget, Daniel Francis and Thomas Stephen. And on the 18th of May 1888 in the Warrigal Guardian and Bulbourne and Narracombe Advocate, it will be with great regret that many friends of Mr. D. Kennedy of the Crown Hotel Warrigal will learn of the comparatively sudden death of his wife, a sad event that took place at 2 o'clock on Wednesday morning. The late Mrs. Kennedy had been ailing for some time, and it was owing to her state of health that our respected townsman, Mr. Kennedy, had determined to relinquish his business here so that he might be able to give his wife a change she required. Dr. Nolan was in attendance during the whole of Tuesday, and towards the afternoon found the complications so serious that he had to abandon any hope of recovery, and notwithstanding every effort, the end came. One of the children of Julia and Daniel was Daniel Jr., known as Francis, died at the age of only 21 in February 1900. And there was a detailed article outlining his death. Poisoned by foul air, a pathetic incident, plucky recovery of the body at Bairnsdale. On Thursday, a young man named Francis Kennedy, the son of Mr. D.K. Kennedy of Mount Taylor, was suffocated in a mine by foul air. With his father, he left home that morning to prospect a shaft on a range about 1/4 mile from their home. On arriving at the shaft, which was 80 foot deep, the father warned the son if he found the air bad, he was to give the signal and he would be at once drawn up. The deceased was then lowered with a lighted candle, which burnt brightly, to the bottom of the shaft and entered a drive of 60 foot long. After working an hour, he came to the bottom of the shaft and said he felt weak. His father called to him to get on the rope at once so that he could be hauled up. Receiving no response, he called again, but the warning was too late, as his son was lying at the bottom of the shaft, overcome by the foul air. The father, peering down, saw him there and could also hear his laboured breathing. Mr. Kennedy called loudly for assistance, but no one being near, he commenced to pour water down the shaft. This he continued to do for an hour in the hope that someone had heard his shouts and would come to his assistance. At the end of the hour, the breathing became fainter and he gradually died away. Mr. Kennedy rushed to the home of a neighbour named Mrs. Good for assistance, and her son, having been sent to inform the police and a doctor, he and Mrs. Good returned to the shaft to await help. The first person to arrive was a man named Anderson, who at once was lowered part of the way down to the shaft, but on account of the bad air, he had to be hauled to the surface. He made a second attempt, this time with a lighted candle, and succeeded in reaching the bottom of the shaft, where he found the deceased lying on his left side with his head partly in the drive. He placed a rope chair partly around the deceased's body, but finding the air affecting him, gave the signal to be hauled up. Mr. Sutherland then made an attempt to recover the body and got part of the way down when he also had to return to the surface. He made a second attempt and was successful in securing the body with a rope, and the dead and living were hauled to the surface together. Every effort was made to restore animation, but without avail. So it would have been awful for Daniel, no doubt. Another son, Thomas Stephen, in an article about his father Daniel, it does state that Thomas died in the Boer War, but I cannot verify that from any army records. Bridget Mary Frances was another daughter, and she was known as Totty. She was the only child to live a long life. She received a half share of her Aunt Bridget Wallace's estate. She married John William Seabrook in 1923 when she was 45 and he was 31. He came from England and he'd been in the Royal Navy and then joined the Royal Australian Navy. He served on the Sydney in World War I and was in the Sydney's battle with the Emden. In 1919, he was living with the Kennedys in their home at Williamstown. Bridget's other sister, Ellen, was born in 1836 in Limerick Island. Ellen married Francis Harty in Melbourne in 1870. In 1873, they were farming in the Winton Greta area. In 1879, Francis, along with others, were held in custody, suspected of being Kelly sympathisers. And it says in 1878, Francis Harty, a poor farmer, said, "Ned Kelly is the best bloody man that has ever been in Benalla. I would fight up to my knees in blood for him. I have known him for years, and I would take his word sooner than another man's oath." So interesting that you've got Francis Harty as the brother-in-law of Bridget O'Brien speaking so fondly about Ned Kelly. And Francis is mentioned on the 11th of January 1879. The Kelly Gang. The Melbourne Telegraph on the 4th of January contains the following telegram from Benalla. "There is great excitement here consequent upon the capture of 3 of the men connected with the Kelly Gang. They are Thomas Lloyd, James Quinn and Francis Harty, the latter being the man who paid for goods shortly after the Euroa outrage at a store here with a considerable number of 6-penny and 3-penny pieces. All the persons mentioned in the above messages, says the Telegraph, are known to be intimately associated or connected in some way or other to the Greta mob. For some time past, the police have kept a watchful eye upon this fellow, and no doubt from the result of their observations, they've been quite justified in placing him under arrest." And at Mansfield on the Friday night, the men have been taken to the lockup where they're firmly secured. They've been handcuffed together and the police are guarding the lockup with loaded rifles. Steps have been taken to prevent a surprise from any of the friends of the prisoners during the night. Tomorrow, the prisoners will be brought before the court and remanded for the production of necessary evidence. And the article outlining Kelly sympathisers on the 19th of April, 1879. The Acting Chief Secretary of Victoria was waited upon on Wednesday by a deputation consisting of a number of respectable residents of Greta, Glenrowan, Wangaratta and surrounding areas. Mr Graves, who introduced the deputation, said that they had come to interview the head of the government in reference to the long period of detention which some of the alleged Kelly sympathisers had undergone in Beechworth Jail. They wished to particularly bring under notice the case of Francis Harty, who had been for years carrying on a business of a carrier in the Wangaratta district and had generally been regarded as a respectful man. He had, however, been suspected of improper conduct in connection with the Kelly Gang and had been placed in Beechworth Jail, where for months he's been awaiting his trial. His wife and family are now entirely dependent upon the charity of neighbours for support. The request of the deputation simply was that the man either should be put on trial or discharged. Hardy's case was one of extreme hardship, inasmuch, if the season were allowed to pass, his farm would be totally neglected and he'd be unable to make a secure maintenance for his family. Mr Kennedy, a well-known and influential resident of the district, also strongly urged that special consideration should be given to Harty's case, as he'd already spent 11 or 12 weeks in jail upon mere suspicion. Now remember that Daniel Kennedy is actually Francis Hardy's brother-in-law. It was impossible to say how much longer he might be detained there, and in the meantime his wife and 4 small children were dependent upon relations and neighbours for support while their farm was deserted. Mr Kennedy admitted that Hardy had, while in drink, given utterance to imprudent expressions and had also had the misfortune of being the nearest neighbour of the Kelly family. But if he was guilty of anything against the laws of this country, let him be tried at once and punished if he was guilty or discharged if he's not guilty. Sir O'Loughlin, in replying, said that the circumstances of Hardy's case were very peculiar. The state of the country, in consequence of the depredations of the Kelly gang, were well known, while in Hardy's case, information had been given to the Crown, which on account of the peculiar condition of that part of the country, it would not be advisable to give in the open court. From what Mr Kennedy himself had said, it would be seen that Hardy had really brought this trouble on himself. He would not, however, say anything to prejudice Hardy's case. But he would give the matter every consideration and get the Chief Commissioner of Police a full report upon Hardy's case. If he then found that there was any room for reasonable doubt about Hardy's offence, he would give him the benefit of that doubt, but he could not undertake at once to set him free. So it seems that Francis was finally released on the 22nd of April, 1879, so only 3 days after that article was published. So it seems that Daniel Kennedy did have some sway in the matter. And on the 3rd of June 1879, there was a property purchased by Helen Hardy, 69 acres at Greta. In 1882, unfortunately, even though Francis was released from jail, their farm was sold by the bank. And it mentions in the paper that they've received instructions to sell at auction at the Royal Hotel Benalla by order of the National Bank 112 acres in the parish of Winton, being allotment number 116, known as Francis Hardy's farm. And on the 2nd of July 1887, so 5 years later, an article stating a very serious accident happened to Mr Francis Hardy of Greta on Thursday. He was engaged in driving some cattle home from the Wangaratta market yards, and his horse, it appears, threw him onto a tree near the State School at South Wangaratta. He was found in an unconscious condition by Mr T. Kelly, who immediately gave information to the police, and they at once proceeded to the spot and found Mr Hardy lying in a pool of blood with a terrible wound in the head. He was taken to Wangaratta Hospital, where he was attended by Dr McFarlane, and we hear he's in a very low state. It is being feared that he is suffering from concussion on the brain. Mr Hardy is an old resident of Greta. The farm at Greta that was in Ellen's name was sold in 1889, and in 1892 Ellen had a farm 3 miles from Wodonga that she put up for sale. And it states, for private sale, farm situated about 3 miles from Wodonga, containing 160 acres, enclosed by 2 rail fences, permanently watered by 6 springs, including fruit and vegetable garden. On the land there's a dwelling of 4 rooms with iron roof, a kitchen with an iron roof, and also dairy and sheds. Francis Hardy at Leneva. There is a recording of a death from typhoid fever in Echuca in 1900 for a Francis Hardy. However, I'm not 100% sure that this is the same man, but Ellen did die on the 31st of July 1915 in Albury, and Ellen and Francis had 6 children, 4 who survived infancy. So it's quite clear that when we look at Bridget's siblings and who they married, and also Bridget's future husband, that Bridget certainly was a sympathiser, and she was probably aiding and abetting the Kelly gang in some capacity. Whether Bridget was Ned Kelly's wife or just a sympathiser, I'll leave it up to you to be the judge.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.